What's up guys, and welcome to this action RPG tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at skills. When it comes to skills, we have this data table called DT skills, and this is where you add all of your skills. Skills can do a lot of things. They can restore health, mana, they can apply damage, and they can also apply damage effects such as bleeding, fire damage, poison damage, etc. And of course, skills can have conditions such as a level requirement and also a weapon requirement. And we can also have one skill be compatible with multiple weapons, and each weapon can do a different animation. So all of these skills right here, whenever you add them, the way it's set up right now is that they will automatically be added to this container. So the grayed out skills are either already in your action bar or you don't meet the required level. For example, we are level 1. This one requires level 5, so we cannot interact with it. You cannot add it to your action bar and of course use the skill. Whereas this one right here, it only requires level 1, but it's grayed out because it's already right here. So if I right click here to unequip the skill, as you can see now it goes back there and I can add it back. When it comes to the action bar here, you can right click to unequip a skill. You can also drag and swap locations, and also you can override a certain skill as well. You can also drag items here such as consumables, and you can use the action bar to execute those skills or consume items. Skills that are added right here are sorted by level. So as you can see, the last one here is requires level 5. And as you can see, this one requires level 3, this is 2. And the lowest level requirement are added first. So it doesn't matter the order of skills in this data table. They will be automatically sorted when added to that container. And speaking of that container, let's look for the main inventory here. And if we go to the graph section, we have this event initialize. So on the initialization of this main inventory, we call the BP skill container, and then we initialize the container. Then we add those skills from the data table, and we sort them, of course, using this function. So let's go ahead and check out this function and see how it works. So definitely take a look at this section of the blueprint to see how, or if you want to change the location of your skills. The container to add skills are a simple widget with a grid. So if we double click on initialize, it's a simple grid widget where we add our skills. So you can easily change this to something else if you want to. So what we're going to do here is we're going to clear out these skills from this data table and then add some new skills in order to explain what they do and what settings you can play around with. So let's go and remove everything from here. And by the way, skills that are by default in your action bar can be added here. If we go to the player controller, then select the inventory component, we have a section here called action bar skills. So action bar skills, and as you can see, we have 6 action bars. And here you can enter the IDs of skills that should be automatically or by default in your action bar. Now, of course, when you save and load your game, of course, your modifications are going to be preserved. So this one will be overwritten. So for the time being, since we cleared out the data table, we're going to simply set these skills to none. So if we, after this, if we go ahead and play, we should have nothing on our action bar as expected, and there's nothing in our skills container. Let's start by making something simple, such as a healing skill. So we can click on the plus sign here. So row name needs to be the same as the item ID. So we can enter something simple, such as heal. The item ID, like I said, needs to be the same as the row name. So you can double click here on row name and indicate the same ID. So this is very important. In here, we can indicate the required level. So this is pretty straightforward. If the character does not have this level, then you cannot use the skill. So for now, we're going to do required level 1, so we can use the skill. Mana cost is, of course, what's the mana cost of the skill. Now, restore health, this is where you indicate how much health you want to restore. So for example, we can say that this skill restores 500. And also you can indicate the restore mana. Cooldown here is in seconds, so you can do, for example, 5 seconds right there. Skill base damage, since this is a healing skill, we don't need to indicate a base damage here. We can select an image here. So let's see if we have some healing spell right there. Supported classes here. This is where you indicate what classes are allowed to use this skill. So in this case, we're going to do all. So all classes can use this. And then, of course, you can also add some weapon restrictions. For example, you can only use this skill if you have maybe a hammer equipped. So in this case, if you leave the array empty, then it doesn't matter what weapon you have, you can still execute the skill. Requires movement stop. This will stop the movement of the character briefly when the skill is executed. In this case, we don't need it, so we'll leave it false. Skill name, we can do healing spell, for example. Attack setup by type, this is where you indicate what animation are played to execute this skill. For the time being, we're not going to indicate any because this is going to be a simple skill that just restores some health. But later, when we add some melee attacks, for example, we'll indicate different animation setups based on the weapon. Damage type here, it doesn't really matter because this is not a damaging skill, so but we can still indicate that it's a magical damage, why not? This is where you apply some buffs and debuffs, such as bleeding, poison, etc. So that's pretty much all we need right now. So if we go ahead and play, you're going to notice that we have the skill added here. And as you can see, it requires a level 1. It costs 20 mana. And of course, it has like a cooldown of 5. So if I use the skill right now, as you can see, it's going to restore some health. And it's going to cost me around, well, whatever mana we indicated there. Now, there is another interaction with the health or restore health here. So let's say that this skill, for example, does not restore health, but instead it actually restores mana. So let's say that, for example, it restores 100 mana. So what you can do here is you can set the restore health here to minus 100. So by giving it a negative value, you indicate that you want this skill to cost health to be executed. So in this case, we can, for example, make it so a skill gives you mana at the cost of your health. And of course, if you don't have the health requirement, it's not going to execute the skill. So once again, mana cost here is 0. So what it does here is actually cost me 100 health to give me 100 mana. So if we go ahead and play here, and I can execute the skill here, if I press 1, as you can see, I actually lose 100 health there. And of course, it's going to give me 100 mana. But of course, here I'm at full mana, so it doesn't show, but it will actually restore mana at the cost of your health. Sometimes you might add some skills that cost health instead. Let's go ahead and add a melee attack here. So I'm going to click on the add there, and I'm going to call it melee attack. Going to copy that row name and make it and set it as the skill ID as well. So once again, row name and skill ID are the same. Required level 1. The mana cost, you can of course indicate the mana cost. You can also make it not cost anything by setting the mana here to 0. So let's actually go ahead and do that. It doesn't restore any health or anything. We will make the cooldown here 2 seconds and the skill base damage 100. Now the base damage is 100, but it can also scale with your weapon attack. So if you have any attack damage from your weapon, so if we equip this one, so this Omega Sword has an attack between 500 and 1000. So your skill is going to deal 100 damage plus a range between 500 to 1000. So keep that in mind. If you want to modify that behavior, go to your character blueprint and look for the action bar key press function, which triggers when you execute a skill from your action bar. Let's continue on with our melee attack here. So we're going to say that it deals 100 base damage. We can give it an image here like so. Supported classes, once again, we're going to indicate all classes. Supported weapon types here, we can indicate that it supports a sword and a hammer. So for the time being, we're going to only indicate sword and hammer. So if you have a bow, for example, you cannot execute this attack. Requires movement stop, sure, we'll enable that. Here we're going to call it basic attack or melee attack if we want. Description, some description, and then the attack set up by type here. This is where you indicate different animations based on the item ID of the weapon. So if we click on the plus sign here, then expand this section, we can say by weapon IDs. We can indicate here all the weapon IDs that are compatible with a certain animation. So for example, I can say that if this weapon or if the equipped weapon is a hammer, then use the hammer attack. Skill to spawn, this is the blueprint that's going to spawn in order to execute the blueprint behavior or logic. So some skills require some maybe a sphere trace or a line trace or whatever in order to apply some damage. So we'll see that later, but for the time being, we're going to simply play a certain animation. So if we go ahead and play and then equip the hammer and of course equip the basic attack. Now if I press 1, as you can see, our hammer animation is played. And by the way, you can also right click here to execute the active action bar. In top down mode, we can hold Alt and cycle between action bars. In third person, you would simply do the scroll wheel. For the keybinds, it can be changed inside the player controller. Now, if I actually equip this sword, even though it is compatible, as you can see, it did execute the skill, but there's no animation because we didn't indicate any. So we need to go back to the skills here and then add another section here. So we're going to add another section, and this time we're going to enter the name Omega Sword, which is of course the name of the sword. Now the weapon IDs are simply the pickup weapons or items in general. So if we go to the weapons data table, these are the pickups of course, and these are their item IDs. So for this Omega Sword, we're going to copy that item ID and then paste it right here. For this Omega Sword, we're going to look for that basic attack, which is the Omega basic attack. So in this case, this montage will be played for this specific item ID. And we can add more if some other weapons do similar animation. So now if we play and of course equip this weapon, of course drag our basic attack there, as you can see, this attack is going to be played, whereas if I equip a hammer, this attack will be played. Now if you want a certain animation to be played for the rest of the item IDs, simply add another section right here, and then this time select a montage, for example some melee montage or whatever, but just simply don't indicate any weapon IDs. So in this case, if the weapon is a hammer, this montage is going to be played. If it's an Omega Sword, this montage is going to be played. And for the rest of the weapons, as long as they're supported right here and here, then they will play that montage, the final one, which doesn't have any weapon IDs indicated. In order to deal damage with this skill, we need to spawn a skill blueprint, which is of course we need to indicate it right here. So let's go ahead and create one and see what we can do with that. So I'm going to go to blueprint here, and we have our BP main skill. This is the parent class that we're going to use to create a new skill or to create skills in general. So we're going to create a new folder here and call it new skills. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click on BP main skill and do create child. So we're going to start by the hammer attack skill. So for example, hammer AoE, for example, AoE attack. And then I'm going to drag this to the new skill and move it there. Let's go ahead and open that up. And this blueprint is where you want to add all the logic necessary to deal the damage. For example, maybe a sphere trace, maybe something to detect enemies, etc. So on the left side here, we have the pawn owner. So this skill right here can be spawned either by your character, the player, or an AI. So an AI can also use this skill in order to apply damage. On the left side here, you have access to the pawn owner, which is the owner of the skill, the one who executed or casted the skill. Then we have the skill damage of the skill that is indicated inside the data table. Then we have the skill target. So some skills can target a target or enemy. And this is how you get it. For example, if you need an attack to maybe follow the target, and we'll see that later with an orb attack that follows the target. Damage type is also indicated inside the data table. So in this case, our melee attack, let's not forget to set the damage type to physical. Then the effects here, we'll take a look at those later for like some extra, maybe fire damage, poison damage, etc. Owner is AI, of course, to know who is the owner of the skill. It could be an AI, it could be a player. And the hostility is how we determine whether a target is an enemy or an ally, and we'll see that later. For the time being, for this hammer attack, we maybe simply want to do a sphere trace in order to detect enemies. So what we can do here is on begin play, we can maybe just do a simple sphere trace, so a multi-sphere trace by channel. The start is going to be the owner skill, which would be, in our case, us, the player. So get actor location. And by the way, this blueprint spawns server side. So if you needed to replicate or have its movement replicate, go ahead and click on cast defaults and look for replicate. And then you can enable replication and also replicate movement if you needed to. In this case, since we're doing a sphere trace, we don't need to replicate to clients. We can simply do everything server side. And then if we damage anybody, then that's already replicated by default. So that would be the end and start. For the radius here, we can do maybe 200. And the trace channel is going to be visibility. Actors to ignore is going to be our owner here. We can set this to for duration just to see the sphere. In order to damage enemies, we have a function called damage multiple enemies. So this function right here is going to take this result right here. This function right here is going to make sure to only damage enemies. So for the base skill damage here, we can do this, and the damage type, we have access to it right there. And then these are the enemies that we hit. We can do a for each and apply effects. We can do apply effects here, and the effects are, of course, these right here. The apply effects, we're going to add some added effects in a moment. But for now, we should do this, of course, once we hit some enemies to apply those effects. So let's go ahead and assign this AoE attack to our hammer here. So if we go back to the melee attack here, then go to the hammer attack here, then assign the skill to spawn, then it's going to be that AoE attack. Now, one very important thing you need to do here in your montage is to make sure you have a montage notify. So if we open this montage, and of course, at some point where you need to apply the damage, that's where you need to add a montage notify. So in the notifies here, you need to right click, do add notify, montage notify. And this is our notify right here. So this is where the blueprint skill is going to spawn, apply the damage, and do whatever logic it needs to do. So let's go ahead and give this skill a try. When you use a trace by channel, don't use the visibility channel, but use the top-down mouse channel. This is a custom channel that is blocked by AI, and we can use it to, of course, trace for AI, etc. Or alternatively, you can also use a multi-sphere for objects, the multi-sphere trace for objects, and you can indicate the object that you're looking for. In our case here, for example, pawn. So just make sure you select top-down mouse here. Let's go ahead and give this attack a try. So we're going to drag that here. So go here, and then there you go. So as you can see, we applied some damage to the AI thanks to that sphere trace. So once again, there you go. So it deals around 226 damage. Of course, that's thanks to our attack contributing to the skill-based damage. And while we add it here, let's go back to the player controller and just indicate that attack as part of our action bar by default. So go to be basic. So melee attack instead, not basic attack. So if we go ahead and play, we should have it by default added to our action bar. Going back to our skill, if we have the Omega Sword this time equipped, this weapon is not going to deal any damage. And the reason is because we need another skill to spawn, just because the configuration is different. This hammer attack deals some AoE damage. So for this one, we would maybe do another sphere trace that does not deal AoE damage. But we can also simply assign the same skill as well. Why not? So for example, that hammer AoE attack, we could also assign it to another weapon. For example, this one, and then there you go. It's going to deal some AoE damage as well. But ideally, you want to do something different because a sword attack, maybe a thrust attack, is different than an AoE attack. So you would do something different, but the main idea stays the same. So let's go ahead and talk about apply effects. So effects are simply bleed damage, poison damage, fire damage, etc. Or maybe movement slow, etc. So what we can do here is with our melee attack here, we can click on the plus sign here and add some extra effects. So if we go ahead and expand that, and we have these options right here, we can add multiple effects if we want. But in this case, we're going to add a single effect. It's going to be maybe some fire damage. So skill unique ID, we're going to give it a unique ID here. For example, fire damage. So the ID can be whatever you want. The multiple trigger behavior is when the target is hit by the same skill multiple times. Do you refresh the duration or of the debuff or buff, or you stack it? Next, we have the effect chance. What's the trigger chance of this effect being applied to the target? In our case here, we're going to leave it 100%. Apply once. This is linked to the duration and interval. So let's actually go ahead and talk about those first. So duration here is going to be how long this debuff or buff, so let's just call it effect for now, how long this effect is going to last on the target. For example, maybe 5 seconds, why not? And then every interval is going to apply the effect. For example, every second here is going to apply some fire damage, for example. Apply once just only applies the effect once. It doesn't keep applying the same effect. So apply once wants to ignore this interval in seconds and work with duration instead. So it applies maybe, so this one you would use it, for example, for movement slow. So you want to slow the movement of the target for a certain duration. You don't care about every second or something like that. So in our case here, we do want to leave this false. Then in every second, we want to apply maybe 50 damage. And here where indicate the damage type, for example, fire damage. And here you can indicate whether this effect restores health or mana or add to the maximum mana as well. This one right here can be used as a buff, for example. When you execute a certain skill, it will add to your maximum health. It will increase your maximum health. And we have an example in the demo. Also the same for mana. This is movement slow. This is percentage based. So you can either add to movement speed, for example, 20%, or you can take or slow movement speed by a certain percentage, for example, minus 50%. So make sure or keep in mind that this is percentage. So if you do minus 100, then you essentially stop the movement of the target. In our case here, we're going to leave it at 0, but if you need to slow down movement speed, do minus 25%, for example. Here you can set a custom effect image. In case you are making a buff skill, you can indicate like an image here to show on top right of your screen to see the buff, duration, etc. So for now, we don't care about it because it's not a buff, so we'll leave it none. So once you do this, you want to make sure that in your blueprint attack, you want to apply that skill effect to the hit target. Later, we'll see an orb attack where we only damage one target, and we'll see how we can determine whether the target is an enemy or not. But for the time being, if you're hitting multiple targets, you need to use this function. This, by default, checks whether the target is an enemy or not, and then it will give us the list of hit targets, and then we can apply skill effects. Skill effects are these effects right here. And once again, you can add multiple skill effects as well. So right now, if we go ahead and hit these targets, they should start taking some fire damage over time. So there you go. So they should, as you can see there, take 50 damage per second for 5 seconds. Let's go and create another skill. This time we're going to name it Orb Attack. So it's going to be an Orb Attack. And the item ID is Orb Attack as well. So we have an Orb Attack or an Orb texture there. So everything else is the same. So we can indicate what weapons are supported, what animations we can play. But in this case, we're going to make it compatible with every weapon, or it doesn't require necessarily a weapon. So we're going to name it here Orb Attack. And of course, some description. The type here is magical damage. Even though it doesn't need a weapon, we still need to indicate the montage here. So we're going to click here on the attack setup. And we're not going to indicate any weapon IDs because, like I said, it's going to support every weapon. Or you don't have to have a weapon necessarily. The montage to play here, we have an orb attack. It's called Poise Orb Attack. And once again, it should have a notify at the point where you want to spawn the skill. And now all we need to do here is simply go and create the skill. So in this case, we're going to go back here to new skills, and I'm going to duplicate this one. So Control W. And I'm going to call it orb or new orb attack. And I'm going to open that. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this. So this orb attack, since it's going to be a moving object, we do need to replicate it to clients. So we're going to make it replicate and also replicate its movement. So this is going to be spawn server side, and that's why we need it to be replicated. And what we can do here is we can add maybe a sphere. So maybe something like this, and apply some material. So we have an emissive color there. Change the scale to maybe 0.5 there. And collision here, the sphere collision by default doesn't have collision, but in this case, since we are going to try and overlap something, we do need it to have collision. So if we go to collision, we need to make it so it does have collision. So we'll do custom here, collision enabled query only. And here is going to be a world dynamic. We're going to ignore everything by default, but we're going to overlap the pawn and then be blocked maybe by static and dynamic. So when this orb hits a wall or something, then we'll destroy it. So we're going to start by doing the event hit. And when we hit something, we'll simply destroy the orb. So since we hit a wall or something, we simply want to destroy the orb. So since we're overlapping the pawn here, we're going to right click there and do on begin overlap. And very important, you want to make sure that you are the server. So it has authority. And we're going to determine whether the target here is an enemy. So we can do hostile. So we have a function called is target hostile, and we can check for that. If we open BP AI main or the main AI and look for hostility here, or we have a get AI hostility function. So if we double click on that, so by default, as you can see, the hostility of AI is set to friendly, meaning its AI hostility towards other AI is friendly. Whereas the character also has a hostility here. So if we get the AI hostility, so the character hostility is set to be enemy, so the character is an enemy to the AI. So essentially the main idea here is that if your hostility is different from the target, then you're considered a hostile. Of course, feel free to change that behavior however you want. So if the target is hostile, then we can apply the damage. So we're going to do a sequence here, then at the end here, just simply destroy the orb. So what we can do here is we can, since this is a target, since this is a hostile target, we can apply some damage. So do simply the default engine function, which is apply damage. The damage once again is right here, and the damage type is right here. Okay, and the damage causer is the pawn owner. And once again, don't forget to apply those effects. So apply skill effects. When it comes to effects or skill effects, there is a component inside the player character called BP skill effects component. And this component also exists in the main AI actor. This component right here uses a IT skill effects interface to communicate its behavior. This is of course available in the character and in the AI. So if you want to see what's going on there, you can simply go to interfaces and expand the skill effects, and we have all of these interface functions that are, some of them are triggered from this component directly, and of course some of them are used to check whether the target is alive, etc. So if you want to modify the behavior of the skill effects, you can use the on effect started and on effect end duration. So we need to add some movement to this orb. So we're going to add a projectile movement. And for the speed here, we're going to make it maybe 1000. Let's go ahead and give this a try. So we're going to go back to the DT skills, select the orb attack, and then skill to spawn is going to be that new orb attack. Later, we'll see how to chase the target with that skill. Before we try the skill, let's go ahead and adjust the cooldown here. We're going to make it a second. And for the skill-based damage here, we're going to make it 100. And also, let's not forget to disable collision on this, very important. So I'm going to select that sphere, look for collision, and simply turn off collision because we don't need it. Collision is handled by this sphere, so go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and give it a try right now. And we're going to drag the orb here and use it on this dummy. And there you go. So it deals 100 and something to the target. Let's say that we want this attack to chase down the target. What we can do here is, first of all, I'm going to actually reduce the movement speed of this orb. So for example, to 300, and then I'm going to set the gravity there to 0. So if you want to know the target of the skill, we have a skill target variable. So this variable right here is available when you cast the skill on a certain target. For example, you point your cursor over the target and then you execute the skill. So in this case, we can actually use something like an event click, just as an example, and we can adjust the location of our orb, or the rotation of our orb and velocity, to keep chasing down this target. So what we can do here is we can get, first of all, make sure that this is valid, and then we can simply do set actor rotation, and we can get the actor or the look at rotation by using the get actor location from the target and from our location, and we can do find look at rotation. So the start is going to be our location and the end is going to be the target location, and that's going to be the new rotation, and the velocity is going to be coming from our forward vector. So get actor forward vector, and of course we also need to multiply this velocity or a forward vector by something here. So we're going to do that would be the speed, of course, so it's going to be maybe 300 there. So let's go and give it a try. So if I execute this skill on this dummy target, it should follow it down. So there you go. So the AI is going to try and chase, and as you can see, the orb is following its movement. So once again, as you can see, the orb is going to try and chase the target like that. And of course, the main thing here is that you have access to it using this variable. So you're free to do whatever logic you need there. So I think that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. There will be other tutorials explaining more things about the skill system, and maybe we'll do some other updates as well to it in the future. Once again, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And until then, don't forget to watch the other videos to learn more about the system. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Goodbye.